The Pacific Theater was witness to some of the most desperate fighting of the Second World War. Intense battles raged against tenacious Japanese forces, whose warrior code demanded death before dishonor. The slow and painful Allied advance towards Japan was marked by a crescendo of furious combat. But far removed from the key battles, a much different war was being waged. One that demanded a different kind of attack plan. One that emphasized stealth and surprise. A plan that would ultimately strangle Japanese shipping. Operating alone on the surface and beneath the waves, often in the dark of night, this relatively small force became known as the Silent Service.
Fleet action was an entirely different thing. Big ships shooting guns at great range. The submarine would mix it with the enemy. Get in close, we would try to fire from 1,000 yards range. The idea was that you're in there, you're hitting them very quickly, by surprise, and you're getting out of there quickly so that they can't pursue you.
America's deployment of the submarine in World War II led to a rare occurrence in naval warfare. One in which technical innovation helped define a strategy. The creation of that strategy was impeded by an outdated pre-war doctrine and a command structure unwilling to release the submarine from its cautious constraints. Consequently, it took many months of trial and error for the attack plan to emerge. But when it did, its lethal effectiveness against Japanese tankers and freighters was as unexpected as it was instrumental to the defeat of the forces of the rising sun. The strategy developed between World War I and World War II called for submarines to support the surface fleet, scouting ahead and clearing the way for battleships. The priority targets for submarines were strictly military. Commercial shipping was considered off-limits. Historically, the attack on an unarmed merchant vessel by an armed warship was known as commerce raiding. This most ancient of naval strategies, a form of guerrilla warfare at sea, had fallen into disrepute by the Second World War. Ironically, the origins of US naval strategy were founded on commerce raiding. This tactic was used by the colonies during the American Revolution, and later by the Confederacy during the Civil War. Fast frigates and privateers became the weapons of choice for the weaker naval power. These swift vessels could seize cargo from unarmed merchantmen and still outrun warships sent in hot pursuit. One commerce raider, the Alabama, was known as the Shark of the Confederacy during the Civil War. In one famous 22-month sortie, her captain, Raphael Semmes, ravaged the Union seaborne trade.
Raphael Semmes was the skipper of the Alabama. She was a Confederate vessel, of course. The Alabama took 60 Union merchant vessels. He nonetheless killed not a single person, and thereby set a very, very humane precedent, and that's why I think he's the greatest commerce raider in American history. Certainly 60 vessels taken as a record. The Alabama was taken by American naval officers after the Civil War as the model for future warfare.
That model dictated naval tactics until the late 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution transformed the United States. A book by an American naval strategist, Alfred Thayer Mahan, captured the imagination of the times.
He came up with his conception of sea power, that is to say capital fleet engagements for command of the sea to break the enemy's will, and if that doesn't work, then you'll invade the enemy if you have to. And he very consciously tried to disassociate himself and the U.S. Navy from the legacy of Raphael Semmes. This book was the right book at the right time, and so he became the man for his time, and his ideas were adopted by the Navy, by the nation, by the industrialists who saw a great profit to be made, of course, in building these big ships, and spurred forward by Teddy Roosevelt when he became president.
Fast frigates were now eclipsed by heavily armored cruisers and battleships. At the same time, improvements in diesel engine technology and torpedoes had turned the once experimental submarine into a true warship. On both sides of the Atlantic, it was largely believed that submarines, like destroyers, would play a supporting role to the fleet.
The war of the submarine prior to World War I was very ambiguous, and apparently the Germans, the Kaiser, had studied Raphael Sims and the Alabama to some extent. There apparently was some tendency within the Germans to think in terms of using the submarine as a commerce raider. But by and large, the thought was that the submarine would be a scout for the fleet, and it might protect the coast, which is a historic role for smaller vessels against invading fleets.
It was the Germans who truly grasped the versatility of the submarine as an ocean-going weapon, one that could attack both military and commercial targets. During World War I, Germany's undersea boats, or U-boats, hobbled Britain's powerful fleet. By late 1916, unrestricted submarine warfare, in effect commerce raiding, had practically starved the British out of the war. She was saved from the U-boat menace by implementing the convoy system, which provided relative safety in numbers. But when the war ended, Germany's U-boat successes were quickly forgotten. England and the United States reverted to their pre-war fascination with large surface warships, dreadnoughts. Indeed, the submarine had even become an object of loathing for some. Its strategic importance was downplayed or purposely ignored. During the early stages of the next war, this neglect would severely hamper the efforts and the attack plan of the silent service. Since the turn of the century, the rise of Imperial Japan had been the cause of increased concern in the West. Following the First World War, America dusted off and revised a long-standing blueprint for a naval war with Japan, Plan Orange. Created at the height of the dreadnought era, Plan Orange had little consideration for submarines. Inspired by Alfred Thayer Mahan's naval philosophy, it envisioned a climactic battle between surface fleets for command of the Pacific.
The Americans would be forced to fall back from the Philippines and then regroup in Hawaii and fight their way west, seeking out a major fleet engagement between themselves and the Japanese. The Japanese pretty much bought into this Mahanian prescription themselves, and up through World War II, they were looking for this ultimate Mahanian battle.
The destruction of the enemy's economy was central to Plan Orange. But using submarines as a weapon was a sensitive issue. The German U-boat campaign was viewed as brutal and uncivilized. The British even lobbied unsuccessfully for the submarine to be outlawed. The United States was a signatory to the London Naval Conference of 1930 that prohibited unrestricted sinkings. As Plan Orange evolved, the role of the submarine was marginalized.
So what do you do with the submarine then, 1920 to 1939-40? The answer is that you treat it again as a scout of the fleet, an auxiliary of the fleet, but the idea of using it as a commerce raider was specifically outlawed.
Even as the submarine reverted to its pre-World War I mission of scouting and support, the vessel itself was undergoing a